Hello, Chapter 3, Extent of Real Estate Interest. This is a longer one, so grab your favorite beverage and get comfortable. We have 6 learning outcomes in this chapter, and I think some of this may be a refresher from principles, but I think a lot of it's going to be new for you, or at least more in depth, because we are talking about the law more in this class. So we're going to discuss ownership of surface, subsurface, and above surface. So in other words, we're talking about in the air and below the dirt. We're going to discuss solar and light rights, mineral and water rights, oil and gas rights, land protection, including nuisance and trespass. And we're going to describe the duties of landowners to those people on their properties. So, land interest above the surface. So this is an interesting image here of seeing above surface rights of land. And in the chapter 1 video, I mentioned a case. I find it interesting, and it was the U.S. versus Cosby, and this was the case about the farmer who had the chickens that were dying and having panic attacks because of the military jets that were flying so close to the farm. And in chapter 1, I mentioned this under eminent domain because that's how this case was ultimately solved. But in this chapter, we're going to talk about it from that airspace. You know, who owns that? And the facts of the case were that the Cosbys own land near an airport outside Greensboro, North Carolina. And the U.S. government used that airport for landing all types of crafts, not crabs. They weren't that close to the water. And the Cosbys lost 6 to 10 chickens each day from the chickens flying into walls caused by fright induced by aircraft noise. And so the Cosbys sued in eminent domain, saying the U.S. was taking their airspace. So the Cosbys were saying, we own that air up there that you're flying in. And the lower court found in favor of the Cosbys and said, yeah, they're right. That's their space. But of course, the U.S. appealed. And so the question is, did flying airplanes through the Cosbys' airspace constitute a taking? In other words, saying that they were taking the Cosbys' land. And the decision was yes, this type of flight was taking, because although every property owner must be subject to some flying, where such flying causes property to diminish in value or become uninhabitable, there is a taking. And so that was a very interesting thought on, you know, maybe, I don't know about you, but I don't go out in my yard and think, wow, I own all that air up there. You know, I think, well, okay, those trees are my responsibility, but what goes on above those trees, is that really mine? So it is a very interesting case. And so your book poses 3 interesting questions in that we can look at what damage did the Cosbys experience. And, you know, the court said, hey, you diminished their property value, which absolutely, because they operated a chicken farm, and that runway was located 20 feet from the Cosbys' barn and only 2,275 feet from their house. And the planes flew over 67 feet above the house. That's low when you think about that. When I think about it with trees, and the publisher goes on to tell us that 67 feet was only 18 feet above the highest tree. And not only did that that frightened the chickens. I'm thinking that would frighten me as well. And so they do say that the cause of the airspace diminishes the value of the property. I mean, I would imagine that would be very, very hard. As an agent, I'm not sure I would want that listing. It would be very hard to sell. And then the court said that the determination of whether a plane is flying too low is found in the amount of damage done to the surface property. So that's interesting to know and to think about how the court is going to heal that, to determine that law. So some complex issues to think about when we're talking about air rights are trees and overhang. Trees that do hang over adjoining property have some rights. I remember we had a neighbor that planted, I can't remember the name, I think it was oleander. It was a very full tree, and it was very pretty, had very pretty flowers, and I know they planted it very close to to their fence to give some privacy between their property and ours. And the problem was that a lot of that was starting to hang into our yard, and we had dogs, and that particular plant is very poisonous to dogs. So there was a problem there where we had to go to the neighbors and say, we need you to trim these branches back. It's your tree. You know, we don't want to touch it, but it's in our yard and it's causing a problem. So that is a more common air right issue, I guess you would say, that we find in real estate. I know that we've had issues where maybe there's a dead tree on a property next door, but because of the size, if that tree were to fall in the direction of our listing, it would damage the house. So those are more of the issues that you're going to run into as far as air rights in real estate practice. Some more complex air right issues, or above surface, I guess we could call them, are drones, airspace, and privacy. There is definitely a privacy issue with drones, especially as they become more popular, where I know that I've been sitting on my property enjoying the evening and having a drone come in and kind of lower down looking, and that's a violation of my privacy. So the question is, when can landowners prohibit drones? Does the right to fly apply? What steps can homeowners take, and who will coordinate those rights? So if, you know, a drone really, I guess, isn't too much different than saying an airplane. If an airplane flying at 67 feet is too low, then a drone flying at 20, I would think, is very, very low. And so there are some prohibited uses of drones, and that is that there must be a line of sight for the operator. They must be able to see their drone. There's a maximum speed of 100 miles an hour. They can take aerial photography. There are limits on twilight operating, and they cannot go more than 400 feet above. I know in some areas, I lived briefly in the city of Tomball, and I know that the police actually patrolled the neighborhoods using drones. It will be interesting to see how things with drones continue to develop, and how laws will change as Amazon and I believe Walgreens and other companies like that are starting to use drones for delivery. So this will be a very interesting topic to stay up on in your real estate career. So what air rights can be transferred? Column lots up to 23 feet, air lots, everything above 23 feet. And then condominium construction and purchase is the purchase of a portion of the airspace. And in your book, there are, it looks like, 4 examples. The first is in Chicago, where the Prudential Mid-American Building is built in the air in column lots above the Illinois Central Terminal. In Boston, there's a 52-story Prudential Tower that's built in the air in column lots above the Massachusetts Turnpike. New York, there's the 59-story MetLife building, and then in New York, there's the Trump Towers built above Tiffany's. So when we talk about the right to light, what are some issues in light? Well, one is, if I have solar, what if something is blocking the access to those solar panels? So let's talk about this. Is there a right to light? And are there solar easement protections? And what about shadows? Your book has gives us a case as an example, and this is the Fontainebleau Hotel versus 4525. And this is a case where a luxury hotel, which is the Fontainebleau, constructed in Miami in 1954, and it faced the ocean. Eden Rock was constructed also facing the ocean. But then the Fontainebleau began construction of an addition that would block sunlight to the Eden Rock pool after 2:00 p.m. So the Eden Rock brought suit challenging construction because of the shadow, and the trial court actually found for Eden Rock. And then, of course, Fontainebleau appealed. And then the question becomes, does a landowner, such as Eden Rock, have the right to the free flow of light and air from adjoining land? And the decision actually came back as no, because common law doctrine of ancient light is not adopted in the United States, and decisions better left to legislative bodies, and no existing statutory basis for existing statutes for protection. So that's very interesting that you know, maybe things we don't think about, of cases that could actually end up in court. So the right to solar light, are there statutory protections? Are there easements? Are there ordinances? Are there solar easements? I know that there are local laws about lights shining onto other properties, but here we're talking about solar, meaning that light is coming from the sun. So maybe we don't think about those things, and you'll see these cases, just like with the chickens, they're more popping up in commercial real estate and not so much in residential real estate issues. So other renewable energy sources and ownership rights, such as wind power and nuisance. So are there wind rights? You know, we've got a lot of big solar farms in Texas, and these fall under environmental litigation. Right to a view of an ocean, a mountain, a lake. So when we talk about right to view, your book has provided this case brief for us, right field rooftops versus Chicago baseball holdings. And in this case, the right field rooftops control 2 buildings and businesses that sell tickets to view Cubs baseball games and other events at Wrigley Field. Since Wrigley Field's construction in 1914, spectators on the roofs of the buildings across the street on Sheffield have enjoyed a view into Wrigley Field. Starting in the 1980s, owners of the buildings began to turn their roofs into grandstands for spectators, and in 1998, the city of Chicago enacted an ordinance formally allowing the rooftop businesses to operate for a profit. But by 2002, there were 11 rooftop businesses operating for profit by selling tickets to patrons who wanted to watch Cubs games and other events from their roofs. Before the beginning of the 2002 Major League Baseball season, the Cubs installed a large green windscreen above the outfield bleachers. The windscreen impacted views from the rooftop businesses. The Cubs filed suit against a number of rooftop businesses, claiming that the rooftop businesses were misappropriating the Cubs' property by charging admission fees to watch Cub games from the rooftops. And that suit was settled through a license agreement in which the rooftop businesses agreed to pay the Cubs a royalty of 17% of their gross revenues in exchange for views of Wrigley Field until December 21st, 2023. So that will be coming up for renewal. The agreement also provided that if the Cubs erected anything from bleachers to screens that blocked the view of the rooftop, the Cubs would repay either all or 50% of the gross revenues received from the rooftop to the point, or there could be reduction in the revenues paid. So that's an interesting case. There's more that you can read on in your book. But again, it's a great example of that. Sometimes we don't think about these things in a residential real estate setting. Surface and subsurface rights. Landowners own to the center of the earth and can convey those interests, which are going to include mineral rights and the minerals which may be on that property, such as oil and gas. So you've got fracking, you've got coal, geothermal. I'm going to skip this case. So oil is liquid, and you can, as the homeowner, if you've got that liquid on your land, you own it, and you can extract it and you can sell it, or you can sell, let's say you can sell part of your property to a company who may want to go in and extract that oil on your behalf. Maybe you're not in the oil business and you don't have the big oil derrick and whatnot. You can sell parts of your land to a company that will handle that. There are going to be government regulations, and there are going to be environmental regulations when extracting that oil. And there's always going to be your surface cleanup when you're done extracting that oil. So types of oil and gas interest you're going to read about in your book. Fee simple mineral rights, oil and gas leases, royalty interest. And you're also going to read about water hydraulic fracturing, which we refer to as fracking. And you're going to read about the federal regulation oversight in doing so, the Clean Water Act, the Oil Pollution Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. You're going to read about all of these in this chapter. And then you'll finish up reading with geothermal energy. Water rights can be a big deal in residential, especially if you're in an area where you sell a lot of land, where people have acreage rather than subdivision plots, because there are how much water, especially if you're working with property. There are a lot of cases out there that you can find on how much into that lake do you actually own. If you start to build your bulkhead and your pier, how far out can you actually go? So you're going to read about that. So rainwater harvesting, you're going to read the different states are going to have different laws about these, about interfering with where water flows. There are some areas you can't interfere with where water flows. You're going to read that in this chapter. And then, lastly, the protection of property rights. And so we've got trespassing, where we have rights of, if I don't want you to come on my property, you can't, and you certainly cannot come and damage my property in any way as well. That's considered trespassing, and these are going to be your local laws. You are going to read about a case with Prather versus Bank of America on trespass. I'm not going to get into that here. This is a longer chapter. I don't want to take up too much of your time. So nuisances can include bad smells, bad noises, invasion through smoke or particles. And this is similar to when we talk about airspace, that when it interferes with another's use and enjoyment of their property. So that's kind of how the court's going to look at those cases. And you've got a nice case in your book, Spur Industry versus Daily Web, which I think is in Texas. So they've, and then so I'm going to wrap this up. This video is getting long. You have a lot of reading in this chapter. But when you're done with the chapter and this video, you will be able to meet the 6 learning outcomes that we discussed about 22 minutes ago. And as usual, if you have any questions or need to discuss something farther or need a better explanation on something that's challenging you, please reach out to me and let's get that taken care of for you. See ya in chapter 4.